Alright everyone, on April 16th, 2025, the UK Supreme Court delivered a landmark ruling. The terms sex, man and woman in the Equality Act 2010 refer to biological sex. This decision is a massive win for common sense, affirming that a woman is a biological female and a man is a biological male. It also affirmed that a person with a GRC, which is known as a gender recognition certificate, in the female gender, we'll get back to that, does not qualify as a woman in the Equality Act 2010. Therefore, the Scottish Minister's statutory guidance is incorrect. In my opinion, the Supreme Court was right to determine the words man and woman by biological sex. I don't think there's another way to define a man and a woman that would be truthful and factual. This matters because the ruling ensures that the definitions of man and woman remain consistent across the Equality Act 2010. The court emphasised in section 175 of the ruling that it would be surprising for terms like man and woman to have different meanings in different sections of the same legislation. The general rule, as we have said, is that words or terms used more than once in the same legislation are taken to have the same meaning whenever they appear, and the general purpose of an interpretation provision is to fix the meaning of a word or term throughout the legislation in question. This decision has far-reaching implications beyond the Equality Act, as it sets a legal precedent for interpreting sex-based rights in future legislation. So attempts to argue that this ruling only applies and this definition of the woman only applies to the Equality Act are misguided at best, because inconsistent definitions of the word woman across laws would undermine legal clarity, and I also think it would chip away at the trust we have in our system, and that trust is very low already, so we don't need to be adding inconsistent lies to our legislation. So, how did we get here? How did we get to a place where the Supreme Court is having to define what a man and a woman is in law? In 1975, the Sex Discrimination Act was brought in to protect women from discrimination on the basis of their sex. What that means is it was there to protect women from being discriminated against because they are female. This legislation also worked the other way around, so it also protected men from being discriminated against based on the fact that they are male. There were exceptions put into this legislation, such as changing rooms, toilets, rape crisis centres and women's shelters could exclude men without falling foul of the Sex Discrimination Act. Those were the exemptions. Women could exclude men from their spaces and men could exclude women from their spaces, and it did not count as sex discrimination. And this was put into legislation, I imagine, because back then they understood that men and women would be within their rights to demand privacy and dignity in spaces such as toilets and changing rooms, or at places like crisis centres and women's shelters. So in 1975, when this legislation was made and Parliament used the words man and woman, they defined those words as being based on biological sex, and those words were used throughout the Sex Discrimination Act to distinguish between the two groups. So there is no doubt that Parliament intended the words man and woman to refer to biological sex, especially since I imagine back then everyone knew what a man and a woman was. In 1999, a legal challenge brought to the European Court of Justice led to the Sex Discrimination Act being amended to include protections against discrimination based on gender reassignment. However, this did not change the definitions of the word man and the word woman. It simply extended the protections that the Sex Discrimination Act provided to individuals who claim to be this thing called trans, which is basically pretending to be the opposite sex. They tried to do this without altering the Sex Discrimination Act foundation on biological sex. When I was reading this, I thought it was a bit absurd to amend the Sex Discrimination Act to include this thing called gender reassignment, even though I don't see a definition for gender reassignment that is factual or makes any sense. It's essentially cosmetic surgery at best, fashion choices at worst. I personally don't know why it's even protected at all, but we'll talk about that another time. And I think it's funny that gender reassignment was included in the Sex Discrimination Act, especially considering these people are always screaming about how sex and gender are two different things. So why do you need your gender to be protected as a sex, even though they keep saying that sex and gender are not the same? Anyway, I don't think any of this should have ever happened. I don't think that gender should have ever been protected under the Sex Discrimination Act, or gender reassignment should ever have been protected under the Sex Discrimination Act. I don't think any man or any woman should ever have been allowed to have protections as the opposite sex, because they are not the opposite sex and they can never become the opposite sex. And I don't think gender, if it really is a different thing to sex, should be protected as sex. So in 2004, the Gender Recognition Act introduced gender recognition certificates, allowing individuals to be recognised as their acquired gender for all purposes. That is absolutely insane. That is a mess on its own, because in my opinion that is taking it a step too far. We should never have allowed this legal fiction to happen in the first place. This idea that you can have a certificate that recognises your gender, but in law it accepts you as the opposite sex. How does that make any sense coming from the people who say sex and gender are different things? These people believe, or say they believe, that sex is completely irrelevant. Get rid of it, chuck it in the bin. But your gender is your soul. It's your soul feelings. It's what your inner soul tells you you are. So if that is true, why do you need a piece of paper that, by the way, you can buy for $5? Why do you need a piece of paper to prove that you're the opposite sex? This issuing legal documents to allow people to lie about who they are should never have been allowed in the first place. Issuing legal documents to legitimise a lie about someone is completely absurd. Like, why can't we get a certificate to prove that I'm an alien? Or a cat recognition certificate, a wolf recognition certificate? Why can't I get a billionaire recognition certificate that certifies me as a billionaire? Absolutely, completely insane. In 2010, the Equality Act consolidated protections against discrimination, recognising sex and gender reassignment as separate protected characteristics. Again, it makes no sense. To me, including gender reassignment is questionable, as it essentially protects cosmetic surgery as a category of people that are discriminated against. If you want to be charitable, it protects your self-identified gender as a protected category, which has no basis in reality. So basically, the Equality Act was about group protections rather than individual protections against discrimination. Instead of having the Sex Discrimination Act, and then maybe, if we're going to cover racism, the Race Discrimination Act, and then if we're going to cover disability, the Disability Discrimination Act, and if we're going to cover age, the Age Discrimination Act. I can see what they did. I can see that they tried to just lump it all together and go, this is the Equality Act. So they expanded the protections and they included this gender reassignment in there. And I don't even know what gender reassignment is. It says in the legislation it's somebody who intends to live as the opposite gender, but it doesn't define what a gender is. In fact, you'd be hard pressed to find any definition of gender that is both consistent and coherent, because everybody has a different definition. Some people claim it's your soul feelings, it's what your soul is. I am struggling to understand why your soul needs to be a protected characteristic when it comes to discrimination, because nobody is discriminating against anybody based on their soul. Other people say it's your fashion choices. Some people say it's what you're born as, but you're not born as your biological sex, apparently. You're born as your gender. Some people describe it in a way that the only way I can interpret it is their mood. It's just simply a mood. And I don't think that anyone's mood should be a protected characteristic, just like I don't think cosmetic surgery should be a protected characteristic in the Equality Act. It gets a little bit muddy when we start adding things in there that are not real. A man pretending to be a woman is a real thing, but him actually being a woman, having some sort of soul of a woman and the body of a man, doesn't exist. So the idea that we're protecting this in the Equality Act is insane. Absolutely batshit crazy. As far as I can see, gender reassignment may or may not even mean people who have had surgery or cosmetic surgery or any sort of cosmetic enhancement whatsoever, especially since nowadays trans means anybody who says they are. It doesn't need to be a protected characteristic, especially on the surgery front. I mean, if you're going to protect a type of cosmetic surgery, why not protect them all? Why aren't lip fillers and Botox protected categories? Why aren't BBLs, Brazilian butt lift, protected categories? They're so dangerous. Maybe those people should be protected once they get it done. They've earned it. They've earned the right not to be discriminated against because they got a big fake booty. I don't know. Maybe I'm giving people ideas. In 2018 to 2022, one of the things that happened is statutory guidance in Scotland redefined the word woman to include those with a gender recognition certificate. What that means is woman is just a man with a certificate, according to the Scottish Representation on Public Boards Act. In 2020, a great feminist organisation called ForWomenScot challenged this definition as unlawful. So let's go back to the 19th of April 2022, when the definition of the word woman was nullified. So this is how I read it, okay? It said that it had been changed to mean that any person with a gender recognition certificate had acquired the gender of female and the sex of a woman. Okay, one of the sentences in the paragraph of the revised guidance that ForWomenScot challenged actually said this: there is no definition of the word woman. Let's take a moment to acknowledge the absolute fucking lunacy of this. There is no definition of the word woman. Amazing. This is the paragraph that ForWomenScot challenged. It says, there is no definition of the word woman set out in the Act with effect from the 19th of April 2022 following the decisions of the Court of the 19th of February and 22nd of March 2022. Therefore, woman in the Act has the meaning under Section 11 and Section 212 of the Equality Act 2010. In addition, the terms of the Gender Recognition Act 2004, where a full gender recognition certificate has been issued to a person that their acquired gender is female, the person's sex becomes that of a woman. What this is saying here is that, number one, anyone with a certificate is actually a woman, and at the same time, there is no such thing as a woman. How does this make any sense, and how was it ever put into law? But this is what happened, and this is what ForWomenScot and Sex Matters and all these women behind it were challenging. This is such incoherent horseshit that I'm actually glad so many ordinary women have done the extraordinary task of challenging this stupid fucking shit and standing up to this absolute nonsense. It's so insane that it ever even got this far. And what's even more insane is there's people in 2025 who don't even know it got this far. In July 2022, ForWomenScot petitioned for a judicial review to challenge the revised statutory guidance issued by the Scottish ministers, which it argues is unlawful because it was based on error of the law, essentially saying it's a bad law, therefore it needs to be petitioned. You can't have bad laws. In December 2022, the petition was dismissed. In November 2024, it went to court again on appeal, and that appeal was also dismissed. So again, time and time again, the courts are saying, nah, there's no definition of woman. The only way you can be a woman is to have a certificate that says you're a woman. Then this was taken to the Supreme Court in 2024, and that's how we got here today. when it goes to the Supreme Court and they make a decision, you can't just appeal it. That is final. They've made that decision that this is how these words are defined, and that's how they're going to be defined in all the laws. Given what I've just told you from 1975 to 2025, can you see how this is like insidiously creeped in? First it started off with, oh, but you need to protect men that like wearing dresses and women with short haircuts, even though they are literally protected by their sex in the Sex Discrimination Act anyway. Then it was, we need to acknowledge them as the opposite sex. They need that acknowledgement in law, even though they have not changed their sex. So it went from, we need to acknowledge these men as legal women, and that's it, we'll leave you alone. Just acknowledge them in law as legal women. It doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't affect you. It won't affect anybody. Then it was, no, these men actually are women. They are women, no different to you. They're female. They were born female. They are female in the soul. They've got female woman soul. Then it was, there's not even any such thing as a woman. What are you complaining for? There's no such thing as a woman. Don't be stupid. A woman is just a mythological creature nobody's ever encountered before. It only exists in fairy tales. It's just funny how it creeps in that way.
Famous artist Birdie Rose, you whack ho, keep this weird ignorance out of my local community.
Can't wait till you die so your grave can become a gender-neutral bathroom.
Boo, your art sucks.
I fear you are on the wrong side of history.
You're a Nazi who hates queer people and makes shitty stickers.
It pisses me off that artists like this get known while there are queer and ally artists that deserve the spotlight much more.
This lady can't stop obsessing over trans people's genitals, even kid. It's all she thinks about. Absolutely disgusting.
You fucks haven't successfully genocide trans kids yet, and never will.
The famous artist Birdie Rose is another sewer making money and seeking attention for bullying. This person is so disgusting they bully and sexually harass children. They are a pervert and predator. People think they are talented. LMAO. People are so lacking critical thinking and taste.
The famous artist Birdie Rose is a bigot. Humans like this person are dangerous to humanity. They speak about lives they know nothing about. Their whole point is to make money of hate. What a sad, pathetic, miserable, lost soul.
Buy my hateful, murderous, genocidal art at thefamousartistbirdyrose.com. At thefamousartistbirdyrose.com.
I think now is a good time to go through some of the ruling that I found interesting. I found it interesting that the Supreme Court actually put it in writing that they're not going to redefine the words biological or sex, or even really accept any sort of challenge to redefine those words, because those words already have meaning that are obvious and long-standing in their definition. And I personally would have thought that any court should have said that about the words man and woman. It should never have been entertained in the first place that there's even a possibility that there are men who are women and there are women who are men, because that is just simply not true. It should never have been entertained in the first place that even though it's not true, we should make some sort of legal provisions for this lie. But what I like is that the Supreme Court has preempted, this attempt to bully them, essentially, into redefining the word biological or the word sex as a roundabout way of redefining the word woman. The idea that activists would challenge the word biological next is pretty spot on. I mean, that sounds like exactly what they would do as the next step to redefining the word woman to include men. So I suspect people in the Supreme Court who worked on this ruling, because they anticipated that this would be the next step, maybe they're a little bit more clued up to the tactics of trans activists than I ever thought they were. I love the idea of them being like, you know what, it's bad enough being asked to interpret and define the word woman, we ain't doing it about all the other words as well. Get lost. It's mental that we're here with the Supreme Court, because for thousands and thousands of years the words man and woman have existed all over the world in all different languages, and somehow they all mean the same thing every single time, and everybody on the planet knows the difference between a man and a woman. Even tribes that are like uncontacted, that as far as we know don't even have a language, know the difference between the sexes, and they probably do have a way of communicating it. So if the word man and the word woman is factually correct, why change it? As far as I can see, the only reason anybody has ever challenged the word woman is to accommodate men pretending to be women. I think what activists and lobby groups were going for is to replace biological sex in legislation with certificated sex. So you're not protected as a woman by your biological sex, you're protected if you've got a certificate that says you're a woman. You're not legally recognised in any laws as a woman unless you have a certificate that says you're a woman, which would render all women as not women, because I ain't buying a certificate to prove that I'm a woman. I don't need one. The only person who needs a certificate to show that they're a woman is a man. The fact that this certificated sex thing was ever considered in any court of law in the UK is just absolutely mind-blowing, but it ain't gonna happen. It's too stupid. Anyway, it would also weaken protections for sexual orientation, such as lesbian-only spaces, which rely on same-sex attraction, not same-gender attraction. It's really, really good that the Supreme Court has mentioned gays and lesbians and same-sex attraction, not same-gender attraction, because that has been a massive conflict as well, where trans is directly in conflict with homosexuality because they don't believe in biological sex. They claim that if you believe in it, it's because you're a Nazi. Stonewall said years ago that homosexuality is bigoted. And you got to think Stonewall's taken the side of trans. That's their new cash cow. And Nancy Kelly, the CEO of Stonewall, not long ago came out and said that lesbians who refuse to have sex with men are sexual racists. Wow. Amazing. Bonkers. When it comes to legislation, the law should reflect reality, not ideology. This ruling is a triumph of truth over ideology. For thousands of years, woman has meant biological female, and man has meant biological male. The push to redefine terms stems from accommodating a small group of men pretending to be women. The law should not enshrine lies or legal fiction. And what's been interesting though about the Supreme Court ruling is the backlash from trans activists and their trans believers and their supporters has been absolutely wild. Out of this world, claiming that this is causing a genocide, although the trans genocide has been going on in the West for at least a decade now, and me and my fella, not being funny or nothing, we did our calculations. No, I'm not very good with numbers, but we worked it out that if there really was a genocide on trans in the UK, they would have all been wiped out at the end of 2015. Just saying. This backlash is completely overblown. The Equality Act already protects trans under the protection of their biological sex and under the protection of gender reassignment, which isn't even really a thing. No other group, from those people with cosmetic surgery to people who identify as animals, has this sort of protection. The narrative that society must rewrite laws, norms and history for a tiny minority is inconsistent with their claim of being a marginalised group facing existential threats such as genocide. What's weird though is seeing trans activists claim that their rights have been taken away and that this is somehow discrimination. Look, defining the word woman by biological sex ain't taking no one's rights away. It was never your right in the first place, or at least never should have been your right in the first place to claim to be the opposite sex within law. And you know what's bizarre to me? So this has been a push around the word woman for years. And what's interesting is that if you're a woman, you'd know this very well. Whenever you talk about women's things, you talk about being a woman, you talk about womanhood, you talk about women's health, you talk about women's issues, trans is always thrown in your face. It's always, what about the men? What about the men who are women? What about the men who are really women in their soul? What about the men who have got women's souls? What about those men? What about the women trapped in men's bodies, which is not a thing? And you're always reminded that this is all about trans. And it's never just about women. We're always being slapped in the face with, what about the men? And I'm absolutely sick of it. And I see all the headlines saying trans women are not women. And it's like, why couldn't you say court sides with reality? Women are women. women defined by biological sex. Why does it have to be all about the men all the time? It always has to be trans women being denied womanhood. It's like, no, you're not being denied nothing. You're not a woman. These men, they have absolutely nothing to do with womanhood or being a woman. They've got fuck all in common with us, especially not physically or biologically. They're not a special type of woman or a subset of woman or a minority of woman. They're just men. Some of them might spend a lot of money on fake tits. They might get their bits chopped off. They might not. They're very likely not to. They might get some cosmetic surgery. They might wear lots of makeup. They might get a wig. Some of them might even do a good job of it. They're still men. Absolutely nothing will ever make them into women. Not even the law. The law, if it had gone the other way and the law had said these men are women, they're still not women, not in reality. So you can lie in law all you want. It's not right to, though. So that's the reason I support the Supreme Court ruling, because they've gone with what is true, what is factual, what is based in reality. The law can only make sense if it's based in reality, if it's based on the truth. It can't make sense if it's all around a lie. This ruling does not create a new law. It just simply restores the original common sense definition of the words man and woman and the word sex. It roots our legal system in reality, not ideology. This decision proves the truth always wins. I'd like to give an enormous, massive thank you to ForWomenScot, the feminist organisation who took this to court. I'd like to thank Sex Matters, who have done lots of legal work supporting women's rights and securing not just women's rights but all of our right to our protected belief, aka our knowledge of reality. I'd like to thank all of the ordinary women who took the extraordinarily brave and courageous task of challenging this all the way up to the Supreme Court and winning successfully, with little to no backing from any major sources such as mainstream media, government outlets, none of that whatsoever. It was ordinary people that backed this, and ordinary people made it happen. Thank you. The truth always wins. See you later.
Woman.